Welcome back, everybody. I have Alex Chaia again, the managing partner and risk manager at Catalyst Futures. Alex has written a book recently on the CSFT masterclass, trading class. Alex, do you have a copy of the book?
Hey Fred, nice to see you again. Yes, here
Yeah,
is
Systematic Trading,
the
the official
famous,
guide to the CSFT exam.
not too big
Anybody
as you
who's
can
looking at
see.
this book, who's taking this exam, will have a well-rounded education in financial markets, from compliance to systematic trading and everything in between. Today, we're going to cover chapter three, right? We're going to go over chapter three,
That's
which
right.
is, yeah, the last one we did was a little dry. It was the compliance area, but I think this should be a lot more interesting. I think we have a lot more.
Definitely, because this has more to do with economics, with the actual trading side, and less
Yeah,
about rules. I think rules can be quite tough to, you have to
yeah.
memorize and you have to be aware and you have to respect them. It's important, but it's much more interesting to talk about the markets, right?
That's the difference between art and science, right? If you study
Exactly.
everything and just memorize it, it's dry. The art of it is where we get into this, looking at some of these numbers, looking at some of these statistics, and determining what the next steps are going to be. And we're certainly in interesting times now. Anybody looking to get involved in the financial markets, I would say that this CSFT course will give you a wealth of information, along with our partnership with FXAQ and the learn while you trade while you learn while you practice. That whole the whole idea, I think, is really is a very useful solution to what we're offering. So let's get right into it. The first part of the book, I believe, discusses central banks and the focus of monetary policy and fiscal policy. Do you want to explain the difference there?
Yes, absolutely. So central banks is it's part of the chapter three. So we're talking about a section. If you have the book there, it's 3.2, which is about economics and pricing. And it starts with a description of what central banks do, why they are important or why they are not important, and where does this come from, right? So the most, let's say, the most popular followed central bank in the world is the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States.
In the U.S., yeah.
Yeah, and here in England, the Bank of England, which curiously, Fred, not many people know this, but they both started as private organizations, and they were not part of a government. Yeah, so the
And
Bank
there's
of
still
England,
some conspiracy theories that believe that the Fed is the central banks themselves are a cabal run by some clandestine groups that are only looking to benefit themselves and not for the. I've seen a lot of these posts come up, and I find it humorous. Someone asked me one time, "What would happen if Congress disbanded the Fed?" I said, "Being in the market for 45 years, you're asking me what'll happen if the sun doesn't come up tomorrow." The markets have always had a Federal Reserve. We've
yeah.
always had these issues behind us, and the Bank of England. Yeah,
Well, the more extreme libertarian economists, what's happening in Argentina with the president, that he believes the central bank shouldn't exist.
yeah.
But we'll think about this. But just covering back to the book, the Bank of England was established as a private institution. It's a private bank that happened to be a lender to the government and then a primarily lender to finance. There was a big financing of the war against France in 1694. And King William, Queen Marian were the two original stockholders. They were not the majority stockholders, but they were amongst the shareholders, and the other ones were tradesmen in the city of London. So you have like goldsmith, leathersmith, blacksmith, all these trading professions that belong to the city and established a bank, and that bank became so relevant that eventually was the primary lender to the government. So
Fascinating.
yes, it's a lot of story. Another book I would like to talk about is it's one called "Till Time Last Cent." It's a massive book that tells the whole history of the Bank of England. It's very interesting if somebody's into that.
Hmm.
But then the Federal Reserve, it's much younger bank. It's 1913 is its foundation, and it already, because of the time it was established as well, it had much more involvement with government operations. So the first task was to oversee, control, monitor the supply of currency, and making sure there is liquidity enough to avoid panics and bank runs. It was an immediate consequence of a bank run that happened in 1903, 1903 no, 1907. 1913 being the foundation year of the Federal Reserve. So it's a lender of last resort as well, just like any other central bank to their countries, monitoring, regulating supply of money and credit, and some bank regulation as well. So these are the primary functions of the central banks. Federal Reserve specifically, you guys in the US know much better, but there are 12 Federal Reserve banks: Boston, New York, Philadelphia,
Wow.
Chicago, Atlanta, and some other main. They divide the US in 12 different areas, which they regulate and oversee what's happening there, monitor inflation, regulate the banks, monitor the credit system, and so on.
Yeah. And, on the podcast that I do, Markets and Madness, we discuss the difference between monetary policy and fiscal policy, um, what the Volcker Fed did back in the late 1970s, early 1980s to jack up interest rate to keep Congress in check. And most importantly, now President Trump is talking about the possibility of firing the chairman of the Federal Reserve, William Powell, and what we discussed in the podcast is that I don't think he has the authority to do that. The Fed reports, the chairman of the Fed reports to Congress. Congress is the oversight body, not necessarily the president. So he can advise, and the president gets some, but he doesn't have any oversight over the Federal
Yeah,
Reserve. They are independent. Yeah.
and just think about the history of the whole institution, which was private, right? So it's a government interference is always seen with a pinch of salt, of course, because in the end, if you are the lender of last resort, including lending to the government, you need to have independence. But also, this is an important point about what's happening right now with Powell, because people also think that he has much more power than he actually does inside the Fed, right? So the Fed has the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, which that's where the interest rates discussions, inflation of over the country is discussed between the 12 members, which are the governments of the 12 Federal Reserve units, which we just spoke about, and all the and there is they discuss, they participate in the meetings, they have an assessment of the economic situation, and then they will collectively make decisions which will be communicated by the chairman of the Federal Reserve. But he's basically the chairman of that meeting and not necessarily the ultimate decision maker. It's that was my point.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And in the FOMC, when they discuss interest rate policy changes, they really just control the overnight rate. They control the Fed funds rate. And a lot of people say, well, if lower interest rates, if the Fed lowers interest rates, that's going to be better for the mortgage markets. Not necessarily so. The Fed only confronts, we like to say that it's like stepping on a rake sometimes, where the Fed controls the front end of the yield curve and the market controls the back end. So,
That's right. So when the Fed or other central banks are discussing the interest rate, this interest rate is affects credit, but does not control it. This is an important distinguishment because when these are basically the rates that the funds that are required from the banks will yield, or the credit that they are going to take to forward it to society or to credit takers when they access the interbank market and so on. So there's a lot of nuances about that, but the point
yeah,
is just because the
we
Fed
always say that
decided on interest rate.
the Fed funds rate is the rate that banks can lend to themselves in the overnight market.
Precisely.
So it's a
And just
short-term
because
overnight.
that rate was decided, it doesn't mean that this will be the yield of the bond of, let's say, the US government. It can be much higher than that.
Yeah, yeah,
Anyways, it will be what investors pay for it, right?
yeah, yeah.
In the
So
end.
talk a little bit about the difference between monetary policy and fiscal policy.
So monetary policy is the policies that affect the supply of currency, the supply of money in an economy. And fiscal, when the word fiscal has much more to do with taxes, with taxation, with
Spending.
lowering taxation is having a loose fiscal policy, and yeah, so
So
they are
In the U.S., Congress controls fiscal policy. They're the ones that write the check. They're the one that controls spending, and the Fed controls monetary policy. And what we've discussed
exactly.
in the past is that when U.S. interest rates, my first mortgage, 1980, was 18%. Actually, September of 1979, I had an 18% mortgage, and people scream about 5.75%, 6% mortgages now. I lived through tough times, and really, what happened then was Congress was out of control, spending, 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 but they were offsetting the spending by pushing it to the rest of the world. And what Volcker did with the support of the president Reagan at the time was to control the monetary aggregates, the money in circulation, and then you really got to see what inflation was all about, what they were doing. So the Fed controlled monetary policy, and he was pushing Congress to control fiscal policy.
Yeah, which is ultimately, like the main driver of economics. It must be how much the government is spending, how big is the debt, and there's a very interesting, very important curve that is usually discussed in economics, and it's part of the exam as well. It's called the Phillips curve. So most central banks, as we spoke about, they have this mandate to promote employment and price stability. In developed economies, it's believed for a long time, and it's usually the target inflation rate in Europe and the US, that 2% per year is the ideal target rate. There are people that disagree with that, especially in emerging markets that tend to have a bit higher inflation rate. But inflation and unemployment are said to be connected and much dependent on each other. So this relationship, there is a trade-off between inflation and employment. This is an assumption, of course, because economics is not an exact science. You cannot do any experiments with
It is
it.
the art, yes.
Exactly. So the relationship between inflation and employment is called the Phillips curve. So there are some examples in the book that are plotting the Phillips curve, and this is a market monitor as well to try to forecast what policymakers will do next, be that in fiscal or monetary policies.
So, I want to talk about some of the economic statistics that both the central banks use, economists use, and traders look at in order to distinguish what their overall positions will be. So we have a few, just to identify a few. GDP, gross domestic product, right?
So,
Give a brief summary of what GDP is and why it's important.
well, GDP is a measure of economic growth. It's probably the most followed macroeconomic indicator to compare countries, to compare economies. And what it is basically is the sum of the market value of the final production of goods and services of a country in a given period. Usually that number is given as an annual statistic. So, 2020 had close to 15 trillion dollars in GDP. United States have 21, and this is a figure that helps us to see how productive an economy is.
The
What's the
overall
total
health of the
aggregate
economy,
value
right? The
they
overall
are?
health of the economy. It's
Yeah,
a determination.
and there are two ways of measuring the GDP, and all the governments, all the statistic departments, they use both to make sure that they are matching at the end. One of them is to the value added approach, which at each production stage of the economy, you add some value and you sum up the total of this. In the book, we give an example of a donut selling for $3. If it costs, like, say, the dough costs is 50 cents, sugar costs 125. So the added value is the price is sold $3 minus 175, 125, and that how much that donut added to the economy. And the other measure is the income approach, which it's a sum of wages, interest, rent, and profits. When you add all the accumulated wages, interest, rents, and profits, you equal both sides and they should match. So in essence, it should be both an income and a value summation, the GDP. And the last one, and this is a very known formula, especially for Keynesian economists, that the expenditures approach. So you look at GDP as a sum of total consumption of society plus total direct investments plus government spending plus imports minus imports. So this is an equation that has been measuring GDP as well, and then they separate the different categories.
Right. Next, unemployment.
So unemployment, there are many ways of measuring employment and unemployment. There's a lot of discussion, and it's very tricky to compare countries' data because they might not
Apples
measure
and
equal.
oranges. Yeah, it's not a
Yeah,
all.
so
Yeah.
yeah, the most shouting a difference is, I think, South Africa that had like 30% unemployment, but that's actually not real because there is a lot of employment, but it's just not official. But
Yeah.
but that aside, employment, you have different times of unemployment as well. So one of them called the structural unemployment. This is when there is a disconnect between the people's skills and what's the employment available because of technology or the economy change priorities. So let's say all cars went electric overnight. You don't need any more in the tank stations. So they're likely to lose their job. So this is called structural unemployment. So AI is an example that might result in a difficult structural unemployment situation. Then there's the frictional unemployment, which is accounted as well, which is when somebody's looking for another job, right? So you just finished one job, you were fired or you quit because whatever, You're sending resumes, you're looking for another one. This is not structural unemployment, this is just frictional. This is just, there's a lot of people unemployed, but they are just moving from one to another. And the sum of these two is the NRU, the natural rate of unemployment, the unemployment that exists when the economy produces a full employment output, right?
I know in the
So
US, we have the first Friday of every month is when the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, releases the unemployment statistics. And they release two separate numbers. One is the employment rate as a percentage, and the other is what they call the non-farm payroll report. One is a household report and one's a government report. One's a survey and one's government. And sometimes they wildly differ, but economists always have an idea of what's expected. And then the shock is not necessarily the number, but how different it is from what expectations.
that's right, that's right. I think the non-farm payrolls is more up to date. It's a statistic that comes way before the unemployment rate, and this is why it's so important to the markets, and also focuses on urban areas and not on agricultural jobs. And a less unemployment, which is in the NRU as well, is the cyclical unemployment, which is supposedly from the ups and downs from the business cycle. So when we sum cyclical unemployment, structural unemployment, frictional unemployment, you get the unemployment rate that is published.
So let's talk a little bit about CPI and PPI, Consumer Price Index and Producer Price Index, measures of
So,
inflation essentially, right?
yeah, exactly. They are both measures of inflation. They indicate general price level increases. They're also shown as a percentage. You need to pay attention what's the period they're referring. It can be quarter to quarter, month to month, year to year. Uh, Usually to give a better understanding, news outlet will say, okay, a year over year number. So that's it. It's price increases basically. If today something costs $1 and then increased to $2, so you had a inflation basically doubled, right? So yeah, that very simple
And
like this.
economists like to play a lot of games with the numbers. They'll say CPI minus food and energy, minus housing, minus everything that you use every day is
Yeah,
unchanged. But the other things that you use every day, inflation is up at 4%, or something
that's
silly.
right. That's right. So CPI, Consumer Price Index, basket. This is a basket of goods that a family living in a city in an urban area consumes. And then in PPI, no, it's not the consumer basket, but supplies for
The producer basket.
production. Um, like always, as well, I would like to mention this because we are hearing so much more lately. It's not part of the test, but some people claim that it's not just a difference in price increases, but it's just a matter of supply of money that never stops increasing. And I recently became very interested in this argument because if you measure the price of a meal or an apple in ounces of gold, you will notice it's the same price for the last 200, 400 years. So it's something to consider that maybe it's not just a price index thing, but a supply of money that is affecting prices.
Right. I always look at the art market. You know, art is not something you need to live, to sustain life. But when, people are paying tens of $1 million for a piece of art and it's beautiful and it's wonderful, it means there's money available. And the textbook definition of inflation is too much money chasing too few goods, right? It's all a supply and demand issue. But
That's right.
the last statistic I just want to touch on is trade figures, both national trade figures, and recently with the tariff issue that's come up from President Trump, trade figures have been a very important part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So trade deficit is
So trade figures.
okay. So yeah, trade figures. So trade deficit, exports minus imports will, if you sum all the exports of an economy and subtract the imports, you will arrive at the trade superavit or deficit. If it's positive, it means there is value, there is money getting to the economy through the trade. If it's negative, it means that money is going out. So
And it doesn't necessarily mean that one country is won or lost. It's just what you can produce and what you cannot produce that determines that.
not at all, not at all. There's so many components. You know, some countries have, let's say, Switzerland. There is a lot of money coming in through the capital account. It's also an industrial powerhouse, but in the end, they might import much more goods than they export, and will have a persistent trade deficit. Or you have the other way around, a country that produces absolutely nothing, but there's like, I don't know, thousands of people that work in the gold mining and they export insane amount of gold and have always a positive balance of trade accounts. Uh, it's hard to measure an economy just by trade. It is an indicator, and it's part of the GDP equation, an important part of it, right?
Hmm. And, just to say once again that these economic calendars, these economic numbers, they come out in a calendar, and you could look at a year ahead of when every month's GDP number is going to come out, unemployment numbers, CPI, PPI, trade figures. They'll all be scheduled well in advance, and economists will all have their estimates, and there'll be a range of estimates. And it's important to know what each of those statistics mean, but more important to know what the expectations are of each and how they're going to affect the markets as they move.
That's right.
Um,
The book also covers a lot of the formulas that we mentioned, more of that as well, like how to
Interesting. Yeah.
calculate the yields on bonds. This is part of this chapter as well.
Right.
So interest rates, simple interest rate, compound rates, how to convert one to another, which is a basically thing to know in finance. And what I would suggest, Fred, that way maybe we can do a separate class just to show the screen, the formulas, how they work out, give it
Yeah.
a few examples
Absolutely.
so people can
But
be
you
aware.
you mentioned bonds, so I know that there's always a lot of confusion when I talk to people who are not um, well versed in the financial markets. Talk about bonds up, yields down. So is the bond up? Is the price up? The price of the bond is up when the yield goes down. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the it might be counterintuitive to think that when the interest rate goes up, you lose money with a bond. Well, why? That's because you bought the bond before the interest rate went up. So, so the interest rate affects the price of the bond, and this is inbuilt in the formula on how the bond price is calculated. So,
The way I like to explain it is when a bond is issued, it's issued at a certain coupon. So let's assume you buy a 10-year bond and it's issued at a 5% coupon. So that means over the course of 10 years, you're going to get 5% per annum interest. Now, if the interest rates go up, so now the next issue of that bond is 6%. Well, you're not going to buy that bond at par. You're not going to buy it. So you're going to buy it at a discounted price. So the price goes down. So now you might buy it at 90 cents on the dollar. You may buy $10,000 worth of that bond at 9,000, still get your yield at 10,000, and it'll equate to the same as the current yield in the market.
that's right, that's right. And this is another reason why bonds, the longer is the maturity, the higher is the risk of that bond, because you have more risk of interest rate fluctuation. There are, of course, zero coupon bonds, bonds that will just pay the rate as it goes which means you don't really lose the principal. But usually those,
And the zero coupons, where you don't, you basically pay a discounted rate up front, and you're going to get all the yield in the back end. You're going to get all your
that's
interest on
right,
the back end.
that's right.
Yeah.
And then usually those bonds as well are the pay very little interest because of this.
Yeah, the benefits.
And there isn't a formula that we explain as well in the book, the bond equivalent yield, which you can look at any kind of bond, see what's the how many times it's compounded in a year, what's the maturity, and so on, and input in the formulas and find out what's the risk and what is the equivalent price. So you can compare, okay, is this bond better than this one? What am I getting for him?
And, our discussion here really is about, now about government bonds, but if someone wants to look as, on an investment basis, about corporate bonds, they're also rated A, double A, B, triple B, and you could look, rating agencies will rate the credit worthiness of that corporation in order to pay. And there's certain hedge funds that cannot invest in anything lower than a triple A or a double A or an A plus or whatever. So depending on the specifics of that fund. So, and that really weighs in on what the yield is. On a very low um, graded bond, the yield is going to be much higher because you're taking on much more risk that the principal is not going to get paid. And we always joke about return of principal, not return on principal. When you're buying a long dated bond or a corporate bond, you want to make sure you get the principal back. I always I always get frightened when somebody tells me, "Oh, this is a great bond. I'm getting 15% interest for the next 5 years." I said, "Well, you may get 15% the first year or the first 6 months, but then what's going to happen if the company goes out of business? If you're getting that type of yield, that means there's something wrong."
Yeah, from 50 to 0 very quickly.
That's right.
Well, since we touched bonds, yields, and zero coupon bonds, I would like to talk about the yield curve, which is such an
Yes,
important, it's probably the most important chart
absolutely.
for traders and economists, what everybody keeps talking about. There are some models that say that you can predict how markets will go or react according to the shape of the yield curve. So it's claimed that the yield curve has some predictive power to forecast economic moves and asset prices both in the medium and long run. There's a lot of myth there. Statistical tests are mixed. There is some truth in it, uh, but
There's the old joke that the yield curve has called 8 of the last 2 recessions or something, something similar, right?
yeah, yeah,
They're all orphan guesses, right?
that's right. That's right. So what it is basically is a plot of the yields on a zero coupon bond of a country for different maturities. So sovereign bonds. So what's if you're looking at Germany, you see like, oh, let's see all the zero coupon bonds from Germany for different maturities, and what's the yield? So they pay, 1.5% for 3 months, 2% for 6, 3% for a year, 3.2% for 2 years, and then you see how what's the shape of that yield curve. And basically, this is an indicator of how the economy will do, how the inflation expectation is imbued with that. Because if it's increasing sharply, then people are expecting more inflation in the future. If it's inverted, people are expecting that inflation will collapse somehow, and the yields will go down with time. So
And those yields and prices are determined by the market. So it's, it's not determined by the government, it's not determined by, any one person. It's just the host of the market, what they're comfortable with, and what the risk tolerance will determine.
that's right. That's right. So then you have the curve traders, that are people who position all the way around the futures along the curve, long and short, and trying to predict how that curve will move. There's so many traders doing that, and this is why the SOFR futures liquidity, which used to be euro dollar futures, but now it's SOFR futures. It's one of the most traded instruments in the world. So you have futures for all maturities to 2032 from next month to 2032. So there's a lot of futures contracts you can trade all across the yield curve.
And I worked for a European bank in the, I guess it was the mid '90s, late '90s, and I got very friendly with the fellow who was running the funding book. So the bank would make loans, and they'd make 3-year loans and 5-year loans, and they'd put it at a certain price, whatever the market was determined, and their corporate customers would accept, and then they would fund it sometimes on a day-to-day basis. So if they were issuing money out 3 years at 7% and funding it day-to-day at 3%, that was a big win. And then they decide, well, maybe I'll fund this in the 1 year. So I'm issuing it at 7%, but I'm going to fund it in the 1 year at 6.25%. And I still have an open gap. And that becomes the curve trade that you were discussing, but that's the natural business behind it. Funding a loan and making the loan.
Excellent.
Talk about duration.
So duration also it's a measure of risk, of bond risk essentially. So as we were speaking about, the longer the time to expire, the maturity of a bond, more you're subject to market volatility, more the interest rates can change, the economy can change, and then you're subject to more risk. So what is called the Macaulay's duration is a concept that simplifies on how you weight the time to maturity of a bond according to the yield. Right? So so what you're basically doing, you're summing the coupons, and each coupon payment you are dividing by that interest rate according to that period, and the sum of all this, you arrive at the duration. So what I would suggest, it's in our next podcast, is we go through all these interest rates and bond risk formulas.
All right. So one last thing I just want to touch on here, and I know we've certainly gone over time, but we had a lot to talk about, is just the idea of the FX markets. Um, you know, can you be long a currency? What does it mean to be short a currency? If you're short one currency, are you long another currency? So just discuss that briefly.
Exactly, and this is really where we are going here, right? It's about, but first you understand how central banks work, how interest rate works, how bonds work, and then the next natural step is understanding how currencies work and how the derivatives markets on these currencies work as well. So this is what we're going to the next section of chapter 3. It's about the foreign exchange market and the different exchange rate regimes. So I can't think of anyone who has a fixed exchange rate right now. Maybe Argentina has some bans, but that's going away very soon. So there's the fixed exchange rate where the government just say, or the central bank just sets that's the rate. Like if you bring dollars, I'll pay this for your dollars, and that moves according to
Isn't
what we need.
the Chinese, is it the renminbi now? Is it the yuan? I always forget what
Yeah,
the new term is.
yeah,
That's pretty
that's
fixed, right?
that's more like what we call a dirty float, because you have the free float is when the currency is just defined by the supply and demand for its currency, and it's freely traded with the banks, and that's a floating exchange rate regime. And then you have the dirty float, which is a mix. So you define some sort of bands, or you have some formula or criterion where it's floating up to a certain point until it's not. Yeah. Now, for trading currencies, there are different strategies for trading that are the most popular strategies for trading currencies, which is carry, which basically you borrow the low interest rate currency and then you buy the currency that pays the higher interest rate, and you make money with that forward premium. There was a
So
big
you
carry trade on the Japanese yen recently. I think that
always, yeah.
yeah, I think that narrowed quite a bit, but that's one popular strategy amongst currency traders. Then you have momentum, because currency is different from stock indices. They have, or no, not necessarily different, but currencies they tend to have for many years the same trend, you know. So because it's depreciating and then depreciates for many years or appreciate and so on. So this is called the momentum strategy, where the traders just position on that row, and the valuation, which basically you compare how much should this currency really be worth. So you compare prices of products in Japan and the US and say like, oh my God, the beer in Japan is so much more expensive than in the US. So something must be wrong with the Japanese yen. You sell there, you buy dollars, and this is
What
called
always
the
used to be popular was the Big Mac index.
exactly.
How much
So
a Big Mac was worth in each currency in each country.
yeah, this is called the valuation approach, which you measure what's the real exchange rate. So you discount inflation from that movement. We'll learn afterwards as well. We have a whole chapter covering this, the costs of trading, which across all the strategies you need to consider not only exchange fees and commissions, but also, you know, like this rollover fees and the interest rates that you're paying on each, which you might think like, oh, I've just borrowed this currency and buy this one. It doesn't really work like that. There are
Right.
much more
So if
nuances
you,
to that trade.
yeah, you borrow the low interest rate currency, let's assume yen at 0%, and you buy the high interest rate currency, right, at 10%. So you're going to make 10% per annum. Well, if there's a devaluation of 20% in the first week, you've lost a lot of money.
Yeah,
You haven't made anything. That's the problem. That carry trade works over the course of a year, and those fluctuations in terms of exchange rate movements can happen in a matter of weeks.
exactly. So, and then we cover a lot of the foreign exchange determination theories. So we cover some of those theories, the most studied ones, which some of them are over 20 years already. Uh, the uncovered interest rate parity, where you define the interest rates according to what's the level of opportunity cost and interest rate on the bonds, and they should you know, that difference can narrow. The covered interest rate parity formulas and the Marshall-Lerner pricing, Dornbusch overshooting model. These are models that think about the trade deficit, export imports, think about interest rates, and try to calculate, to figure out how exchange rate works and how they are determined in the marketplace with all this data available. So, yeah.
Well, I think what you said as we started this discussion on FX is very interesting for what our partnership with FXAQ. FXAQ gives you the ability to buy a challenge, to set up a prop account where you can look at all of your ideas about bonds, about interest rates, about GDP and PPI and unemployment, and make a determination on a foreign currency trade. And once again, practice while you learn. And if you're successful and you meet your challenges, you get a funded account and you can continue trading.
Precisely. All the formulas are in the CFST book. You can apply those formulas, calculate what's the equilibrium rate, and balance your opinions about it, place the trains, and put it into practice. So that's how the two go along very well together.
what we always used to say, a market is really an argument. It's a refined argument. You think the price is X, I think the price is Y. Well, I'm going to buy, you're going to sell, and then we'll see who wins that argument, right? And it's done in a very efficient, very civilized manner. It's not screaming and yelling and beating someone over the head. I'm going to buy, you're going to sell, and then we'll see. And
That's
we all
right.
have different time frames of how it's going to work, but it always is a very elegant and sophisticated way to grow these financial markets. So I think, we've certainly gone over time, but once again, we had a lot to cover. I think the next chapters are going to be a lot more interesting as we go forward. Each one seems to offer more and more. So, anything else you want to add as we sum it up?
No, I think that's it, Fred. I think I would suggest we go through some of the bond formulas because that's an interesting topic. And I think it's important for the CFST candidate to understand the inner workings of interest rates and currency determination. So.
Yeah, and the CSFT certification, it's a great tool. The book is a great book, and the course gives you a wealth of it. What we've touched on here is a tiny subset of one chapter. So think of what you get in the overall course and the overall test and what you can learn. So Alex, once again, I want to thank you. I think it's been a very enlightening conversation as always, and we'll pick this up next time with the next chapter.
Thank you, Fred. See you soon.
Have a great afternoon. Cheers.